There is a particular silence that arrives somewhere near the 40th year. It does not arrive at the moment of failure. That would be bearable. Failure has a shape. Failure gives you something to fight. This silence arrives at the moment of arrival. The promotion signs, the mortgage clears, the child sleeps down the hall. You stand in a kitchen you own, in a life you built, holding a glass of water at 4 in the morning, and you feel absolutely nothing. And the thought comes unbidden, in a voice you almost recognize as your own. Is this it? Carl Jung called this moment the noon of life, the sun at its highest point, beginning imperceptibly, irreversibly, its descent. And he observed something the modern world has spent a century trying to medicate away. That the psychological program which built the first half of your life becomes actively poisonous in the second. Tonight, we are going into that descent, not to escape it, to use it. Understand first what you actually built. Between 18 and 35, you did not build a life. You built an instrument, an apparatus designed for a single function, to extract from the world the things the world had told you were worth extracting. Security, status, a partner, a title that sounds respectable when spoken at a dinner table. Jung named that instrument the persona, from the Latin for the mask worn by an actor in the ancient theater. And he was careful to say, the persona is not a lie. It is a necessity. It is the contract you sign with society. I will present this face, and in exchange, you will let me pass. The tragedy is not that you wore the mask. The tragedy is that you were so good at wearing it that you forgot to keep anything behind it. Here is the mechanism nobody explains to you. Every choice that built the instrument was a choice against something. To become the lawyer, you executed the musician. To become dependable, you executed the reckless one. To become the man who provides, you executed the man who wanders. These were not casual preferences you set aside. They were living psychic possibilities, and you killed them, deliberately, one by one, because the instrument required it, and you were right to. That is the brutal part. In the first half of life, that amputation is correct. A young man who refuses to specialize becomes nothing at all. But the dead do not stay buried. They accumulate. Somewhere below the threshold of your daylight consciousness, every murdered possibility gathers into a single mass. And Jung gave this mass a name. He called it the shadow. And the great misunderstanding of our age is that people think the shadow is their cruelty, their appetite, their capacity for violence. Sometimes. But at midlife, the shadow is something far stranger and far more painful. At midlife, the shadow is everything you were capable of becoming and did not become. It is not your darkness. It is your unlived life. And it has been sitting in the basement for 20 years, fully alive, doing push-ups in the dark. This is why the crisis arrives at the summit and not at the bottom. As long as the instrument was still being built, the shadow could be silenced by the noise of construction. There was always another rung, another target, another decade of not yet. Then the building stops. The last rung is climbed. The silence descends. And in that silence, for the first time in your adult life, you can hear what is underneath the floor. Now watch what the psyche does next, because it does not sit quietly with this information. What follows is the phenomenon we have cheapened with the phrase midlife crisis, a term that reduces one of the most significant events in a human life to a joke about a sports car. But look at the sports car properly, and you will see what it actually is. The man who at 45 buys the motorcycle, takes the young lover, quits without a plan, or announces a sudden spiritual conversion, he is not being frivolous. He is being possessed. The unlived life has finally broken the cellar door, and because he never opened it consciously, it comes up the stairs in its crudest, most primitive, most compulsive form. Jung described a law he called enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme, held long enough to violently convert into its opposite. The man who has been dutiful for 25 years does not become moderately spontaneous. He detonates, and here is the merciless irony. He believes he is finally being authentic. He is not. He has simply exchanged one mask for another. And the second mask is worse because it was not chosen. It was fired at him from below. Now, the second failure mode, the one that afflicts the intelligent, because there is a class of person who will never buy the motorcycle. He is too self-aware for that. He has read the books. He knows the terminology. He can identify his own persona in a sentence, name his projections, diagnose his father complex over dinner, and get a laugh out of it. He has turned the crisis into a subject. Dostoevsky drew this man with terrible precision more than a century and a half ago in a basement in Petersburg. The underground man, a creature of monstrous consciousness who understands his own condition more completely than anyone around him, and who is, for exactly that reason, totally paralyzed. He watches himself think, then he watches himself watch himself think, and the acute awareness becomes not a ladder out of the pit, but the walls of the pit itself. Dostoevsky's insight was that beyond a certain point, consciousness stops being an instrument of life and becomes a disease, a way of experiencing everything and touching nothing. If you are the kind of person who watches videos like this one, understand that this is your specific danger, not the sports car, the analysis, because insight feels like movement. You finish a book on individuation and something in your chest loosens, and that loosening feels like progress. It is not progress. It is anesthesia. You have found a more sophisticated way to remain exactly where you are, and you will do it for another 5 years if nobody stops you. So let us be exact about what is actually happening in the abyss, underneath both the detonation and the analysis. Jung's proposition was this: the first half of life belongs to the ego. Its task is adaptation, competence, position in the world. The second half belongs to the self, and the self is not interested in your position. The self is interested in wholeness, in the reintegration of everything you exiled, which means the depression you are feeling is not malfunction, it is demand. Jung suggested that neurosis is very often the suffering of a soul that has not found its meaning. The symptom is not the enemy. The symptom is the psyche refusing at last to keep financing a life that has become too small for it. The hollowness is not a sign that you have failed. It is a sign that the instrument you built has completed its work and is now being dismantled by something older and more intelligent than your plans. So what do you actually do? Not what do you understand. What do you do? Tomorrow, in your body, in your calendar, in the world of consequences. First, stop trying to climb out. Every instinct you have will scream for a solution, a system, a protocol, a 5-year plan to restore the feeling of momentum. That instinct is the ego attempting to survive its own necessary demotion. The descent is not an interruption of the path. It is the path. You do not solve the abyss. You go down into it on purpose, with your eyes open, which is the single difference between a descent and a collapse. Second, change the question. For 20 years you have asked, what do I want? That is the ego's question. And at midlife, it returns nothing but static, because the ego has already got what it wanted and discovered the prize was hollow. The second half question is colder and far more useful. What has been trying to live through me that I have refused? You already know the answer. That is the uncomfortable part. It is not hidden. It is the thing you think about at 4 in the morning and dismiss by 7 as impractical. It is the abandoned instrument in the closet. The language you never finished. The work you talk about only when drunk. The version of you that got executed at 26 so the mortgage could exist. You are not required to become that person. You are required to stop pretending he is dead. Third, and this is the hinge of the entire thing, you must move from analysis to friction. Individuation does not occur in your mind. It cannot. The mind is where the persona lives, and the persona will happily host an endless, beautiful, sophisticated conversation about your transformation for the rest of your natural life. Integration happens where the world can push back. It happens when you make one thing badly with your hands. When you say the true sentence out loud to the person it concerns and watch their face change. When you do the unimpressive, ungraceful, publicly mediocre version of the thing you have been privately perfecting in your imagination for a decade. Because the shadow cannot be reasoned with, it can only be lived with. Given small, deliberate, contained expression in reality, so that it stops accumulating pressure in the dark. The point is not the outcome. The point is the friction. The point is that reality gets a vote. And the moment reality gets a vote, the fantasy dies, and something smaller, real, and load-bearing takes its place. And now, the hard truth, the one that makes the rest of it work. Half of your life is gone, not metaphorically. Actually, there is a finite and unknown number of mornings remaining, and the number is smaller than it has ever been. The culture will tell you to deny this, to stay young, to keep climbing, to treat 40 as the new 30, and the whole thing as a matter of energy management. Jung's counsel was the opposite. He observed that a man who clings to the program of the morning must pay for it in the afternoon with damage to his soul. The one who tries to carry the first half's ambitions into the second half does not stay young. He becomes a ghost of his own youth, increasingly frantic, increasingly hollow, still performing a role the audience left long ago. But the finitude is not the curse. The finitude is the only thing that makes meaning possible. An infinite life would have no shape, no stakes, no requirement to choose. It is precisely because there are not enough mornings that some things become worth the mornings you have. The abyss at midlife is not the end of your life. It is the first honest conversation your life has ever tried to have with you. Most people refuse it. They take the motorcycle or they take the analysis, and either way, they arrive at 70 with the cellar door still locked and a bill they can no longer pay. You do not have to be most people. Go down, meet what is down there, and then come back up, carrying something and put it, however clumsily, into the world. That is not a recovery from the midlife crisis. That is a second half of a life beginning. If this reached something in you, the descent continues in the next essay, where we go into the rage that lives beneath the unlived life and what Jung understood about conquering the shadow rather than merely observing it. Subscribe. Stay in the dark a while longer.